Next up on our tour of the ways in which humans affect biodiversity worldwide is through the introduction of invasive species. Now, typically, an invasive species is a non-native species to an area. It means an organism that has not historically evolved and developed in that area. They are not part of the natural ecology, such that their population growth in that area is going to alter the composition of that community. As this population grows, other populations will decline, because many of the organisms in that area are unaccustomed to dealing with its presence, either because it's a new kind of herbivore, so it's eating all of the plants that are in that area, or it's a new kind of carnivore, so it's eating some of the other animals, or it's outcompeting some of the other carnivores, so their populations may be depressed as well. Adding a new organism completely shifts the competitive balance of the ecosystem. You can't add a new puzzle piece into a jigsaw puzzle and expect everything to still fit together the way it used to. Everything's got to kind of adapt to that. Now, organisms migrate all the time. They move from place to place. They spread. If the population density becomes too high, we talked about this with lemmings, they will spread out to new locations, right? So this can happen naturally, right? A new population, a new species can arrive in some ecosystem to which they were not previously adapted, and then they will adapt to those new circumstances. The ecosystem will react to their presence as well. They will find some niche for themselves, and they will be incorporated in. Typically, that happens very, very slowly because the rate of population spreading is going to be limited to the environmental conditions in which that population can survive, how quickly they move over land, because they would have to physically walk or crawl or spread on the wind or fly to new locations. All of these factors. And on top of that, whether or not they can actually establish themselves in a new location. However, humans coming up with things like roads to make travel much, much faster, being able to take large numbers of goods from location A to location B. Well, sometimes those goods include animal life. Sometimes those goods include plant life. Sometimes the mud on the wheels of those carts that are traveling along the roads contain seeds inside them, or spores of fungus, or other types of organisms, bacteria, or anything like that could come along for that ride. Shipping traffic, much the same. From the early days of shipping, barnacles would attach to the outside of a boat. They would sail across the world. They would then be delivered to other types of oceans. Same with mussels. And also, boats take on what's called bilge water in order to balance themselves out. So sometimes water is taken into the hull of a ship. Sounds counterintuitive, right? You want to keep water out of a boat. But in order to balance it, sometimes a little bit of water is taken into the bottom in order to stabilize the boat. And that can contain microorganisms. It can contain fish. It can contain larvae of sea anemones or mussels or any of these kind of organisms. So in many cases, bilge water is taken in one location and it's leaks out in other locations. Same idea, mud can be brought on from distant places. And then all these problems still exist when we talk about modern traffic, modern shipping routes, because they still use bilge water and this kind of thing, modern roads, modern airplane travel, modern commutes, but it's much faster. So while there is a natural migration of organisms from one location to another, and ecosystems adapt and the organisms adapt, and there's this kind of natural push and pull of them, the effect of humans is to accelerate the introduction of species from one location to the next. And effectively, it's as though the world is smaller. The distance that those organisms have to cross is much, much shorter, because they're just hitching a ride in a little bit of mud on the bottom of someone's boots or something like that. Before all that, those transportation lanes and transportation methods were created, it was virtually impossible for some species from, say, Asia to make it all the way over to North America and establish itself. It would take months. It would take a very long time to get from one continent to another. But now that can happen overnight, right? So it's much, much easier for a live specimen to show up. And when that happens, and they are introduced, and we're doing lots and lots of these introductions, it's going to be a lot more frequent that you get the wrong species in the right environment where they will be able to establish themselves very, very well and take off. It will be like those rabbits that we talked about in population ecology, where they were introduced to Australia, and it was like a place of unlimited resources, where there was no competition, no diseases, no predators, plenty of food, and their population exploded as a result. That is an invasive species. And there are many examples of invasive species all over the world. I'm going to talk about a few of them. Now, all of that said, I did say that an invasive species is usually a non-native species. It does not have to be, but in 99 examples out of 100, it will be a non-native species that's introduced. Technically, to be an invasive species, all it really needs is for its population growth to be so out of hand that it's causing environmental damage. And this can happen with a native species. Some environmental factor can change, which promotes the growth of a native species so much that it's outcompeting all of the other native species in the population. So that's possible too, but usually invasive species are non-native. Notes on the bottom of this slide here. Typically, they exhibit opportunistic life history patterns. Makes sense, right? If it's all about reproduction rates, well, opportunistic organisms reproduce lots and lots and lots of organisms, right? They have lots of offspring, as many as they possibly can. Don't do any parental care, or very limited parental care, because they are trying to have as many offspring as possible on the slim hope that a couple of them will survive and reproduce the next generation. So that's more common with invasive species, that they reproduce very rapidly, but not every invasive species. Some of them reproduce comparatively slowly. They do have very strong negative impacts on native species and biodiversity, as I mentioned, and they are economically important as pests. They are big negative economic burden as pests, and it's estimated that they cost us about $125 billion a year annually. In terms of lost crop revenue, agricultural revenue, in terms of lost recreational value for damaged ecosystems, in terms of lost ecosystem services, wetlands that are, see this purple flower over here? This can damage the ability of wetlands to absorb stormwater and manage it. So that can increase flooding, which means more flood damage downriver of that. That also increases damage. So some of these invasive species have very profound damage on human economies. One that you're likely familiar with just in your everyday life is the brown marmorated stink bug, right? Everyone hates these stink bugs. And they say they have a terrible, terrible smell. I actually can't smell it. I think it's genetic, whether or not you're able to smell the stink bug smell. But nevertheless, they are economically important as pests, because what they do is they go to fruit orchards and they have it's kind of almost like a hypodermic needle on the front of their face, a little proboscis, and they inject it into the fruit, and they secrete enzymes under the skin of the fruit, which starts breaking down some of the sugars and things inside, and then they suck up some of the nutrients that are inside that fruit, but that creates this soft, nasty brown spot. And so only the most cosmetically attractive fruit ends up going to grocery stores, so any fruit that's been damaged by these stink bugs just gets tossed out. So they damage lots and lots of crops because they are a prolific invasive species in this area. Here's some more examples of invasive species. This is a red-tailed boa, which is considered a pretty cool pet to have. And people get these pets, when they're like foot long, 2 feet long. And it's an easy pet to take care of because reptiles have slow metabolism. They don't need to be fed every day all the time. A couple feedings a week is normal. You can feed it a mouse every now and then, and it's happy. And it'll continue growing, so you might need to get a larger tank eventually as it gets larger to keep it in. Just make sure it has a hot light. And as it gets larger, though, you're going to need maybe not a mouse anymore. Maybe you need to feed it a rat at certain intervals. And it's going to keep growing, and maybe then you need to switch to like a rabbit or something like that. And these can get quite long. These can get over 6 feet long or bigger. And maybe over the years that you've had this, your life has changed somewhat from when you initially got it. Maybe you thought it was a cool pet to have when you were in high school, but now you're in your 30s or something like that. You're settling down. You have kids, and you're looking at the size of the rabbit, and you're looking at the size of your newborn baby, and you're thinking, I don't want to keep this large snake in my house anymore. But what are you going to do? It's hard to find someone to purchase a full-sized red-tailed boa frequently. So what a lot of people do, sad to say, is that they just release them into their backyards. In a lot of climates, the snake won't survive because they are meant for very warm climates, and large parts of the United States have winters, and these snakes will just die over winter because they're not adapted for seasonal climates like that. But in Florida, where it's fairly warm year-round, they have actually established themselves, and some red-tailed boas have managed to find other red-tailed boas out in nature, and they have made little red-tailed boa babies, and they have created a little population out there, and they have become a brand new predatory invasive species in that area. And adding a new predator to a location has a substantial impact on the ecosystem. Think about all that talk about trophic structures we did back in Unit 1. We were talking about the feeding relationships and energy flow diagrams, right? It all moves up to those predators at the top. So if you add some new organism up at the top and you're adding new competition for the top tier predators in that area, that's really going to mess with the dynamics of that ecosystem. So here is a image of a snake swallowing an alligator, and this is true. When a snake meets an alligator, who is lunch and who is going to eat, it really depends on the relative size difference that particular day. So they outcompete some of the native alligators in that area. Sometimes they just straight up swallow them, and it does work the other way around. So that's red-tailed boas. This is the spotted lanternfly, which you might know a little bit about in this area. You may have seen them before. And click on it, you can see what they look like in their nymph stage, which they don't fly, but these ones hop around, and then when they proceed into their adult stage, they look like this. And these are sapsuckers. They will infect the outsides of trees or attach themselves to the outsides of trees, and they will try to get all of the sap out from underneath the bark. And they have been relatively recently introduced to Pennsylvania, but they have spread and multiplied pretty prodigiously. You can see this map of where they have been identified and where they seem to be most frequently cited, and right in our area, right around Philadelphia, is the most dense cluster of them. And they are having profound damage on a lot of our trees around here. You can, in my neighborhood, I've actually walked around and seen trees that one year had, thousands of these things on the outside of the bark, and the next year the tree is just dead. So a lot of people are now putting tape traps around the base of their tree, so that when these spotted lanternflies are in their younger stage here, the black and white spotted stage, and they have to kind of walk up the tree, they get caught there, so that kind of stops them in their tracks, prevents them from ever being able to get to that adult stage. And there are other treatments for essentially applying pesticides to trees in order to try to preserve them. There are certain species of trees that they favor more than other species of trees, so we're trying lots of different selective management, but this pest has been pretty nasty for us. So that's one that's been in Pennsylvania lately, and we are still dealing with emerald ash borers, which were introduced a few years ago and have decimated our ash tree population at the same time. So Pennsylvania has quite a few invasive species. And here's another one that's in Pennsylvania. This beautiful looking flower is called purple loosestrife, Lythrum salicaria. And it is a very lovely plant. It's an invasive species, but I mean, that doesn't make it any less beautiful. And it shows up in wetlands. Wetlands, very important ecosystem, as I've mentioned countless times before at this point. There is a native species of loosestrife, so a cousin to this plant that lives in Pennsylvania, Lythrum alatum. When both of those plants are located in the same wetland, bees, the pollinators for these flowers, greatly prefer to visit Lythrum salicaria, the non-native one, this one, purple loosestrife. And the reason is because the non-native has bigger flowers, showier flowers, brighter colors with more full coverage. The flowers on our native one, they're pink like this, but they're more sparse, they're smaller, they're not as eye-catching. So in a way, this is mirroring discussions you might have in a marketing class about branding, like packaging on the outside of a cereal box or something like that. The bees are going for the one with the more attractive branding, the one that says, hey, look at all these pretty flowers over here, and they're deciding where they want to go eat, where they want to go hunt for nectar. They're going to go to the one with the bigger flowers. So they disproportionately go and they visit the purple loosestrife plants, and then the native ones don't get pollinated. Now, the problem is purple loosestrife has a much denser network of roots that goes through the soil, and they're so thick that they sort of outcompete and choke out any other kind of vegetation in that area. And it's also a woody, persistent rootstock, it's called. And that means that even if you go through and you mow all of this stuff, just go through with wait for it to be dry, obviously, and then you go through and you mow it, all of the purple loosestrife will just come right back because the roots have the ability to just spring the stems right back up, and then the flowers will pop right back up. So as long as the roots are alive, the whole plant, the whole organism will remain alive. They are also prodigious seed producers. They are able to create thousands upon thousands upon thousands, I think even up to the scale of millions of seeds per plant, which not every one of those seeds is going to become its own adult, but they can remain viable in the soil, in the mud, for many, many years afterward. So even if you were to go through and yank all of these plants out of the wetland, they still are the most dominant seed type in the soil, and they grow pretty rapidly as well. So even if you completely clear them out and you let natural succession take place, they're still going to be the ones that pop up first and then dominate again because they've already kind of established themselves. So they're a very difficult plant to get rid of, and they can outcompete all other native vegetation. So once you have these starting to grow up, the wetland becomes more similar to a monoculture. You get a loss of all other types of wetland plants, so you decrease biodiversity. And any of the animal species that were relying on those other wetland plants, their populations are going to decline as well. These flowers aren't as good for nesting material for a lot of the birds that live in wetlands. Some studies have shown that you have far fewer nests of songbirds and things like that in the purple loosestrife versus the native loosestrife. The root systems will actually choke out like drainage pipes and things that are meant to help mitigate some of the water that comes through here. So they can cause infrastructure problems. It's a big problem plant. In fact, they are such fierce competitors that they outcompete cattails in wetlands. And I know that doesn't sound amazing if you don't know anything about wetland ecology, but Nothing outcompetes cattails in wetlands. You have to, if you're trying to construct an artificial wetland, you have to be so careful to set up your nutrient balance and the amount of water coming in and every little physical factor of your wetland to make sure that you get a biodiverse wetland that is not just cattails. Cattails are usually the thing that comes through and outcompetes all of the other vegetation, but these push cattails out of the way. That's how fierce a competitor they are. So how do we get rid of them? Right? If we can't burn them, which we tried, we can't mow them, we can't weed them, what are we going to do? We use biological control. That's where you take a species that is a predator or predates in some way on the pest species that you're interested in, and you introduce it. Now, you may remember that when I talked about population ecology, they tried this with the rabbits. The rabbits were a big problem in Australia, and then they introduced European foxes in order to try to control the rabbits, and then the fox population became its own invasive species. So you have to be very, very careful with biological control. And they were very, very careful. They tested hundreds of insects, insect species to introduce onto this plant from its native range, species that were in some way inextricably tied to this species. Some part of their life cycle required the usage of this species. They fed on it, or they laid their eggs in it, or they did something that required specifically purple loosestrife. And they tested how these species would interact with every other plant in that ecosystem, even the native loosestrife, which would have been the closest cousin in that area. And they narrowed down the list to a small number of insects. They got some weevils and they got some beetles. They had some that would attack the roots. They were root-boring insects that would kind of dig their way into the roots, eat away any kind of sugars stored in the roots in that wood stock, eat away any nutrients in there, and they made their home in the roots. That damaged the plant's ability to obtain nutrients from the soil, to obtain water from the soil, and that lowered how much biomass it could ultimately put on. They had leaf-eating insects that only ever ate the leaves of this particular plant. They had flower boring insects that completed part of their life cycle by eating out the reproductive parts of the flower and then nesting essentially inside of the flower. Other ones bore into the stem of the plant and laid their eggs and lived in there and got their nutrients from in there. So they added insects that attacked the plant on every front: the stem, the flowers, the leaves, the roots. And all of these insects, our studies showed that if the population of this plant started to go down, they wouldn't be able to adapt to the other wetland vegetation. So their populations would also go down. Just like when we looked at the Arctic lynx and the Arctic hare, remember when one population went down, the other population went down? Same with these insect species. And it started to have an effect. The amount of purple loosestrife started to decrease as a result of the actions of all of these plants, because we damaged its ability to grow. We damaged its ability to reproduce. We damaged those roots. You can't get rid of a species this way, but you can dramatically decrease its effect. So this is one way, or at least one time in history, where we used biological control, and it worked, and we did a good job on it. So, just like any population, invasive species will benefit from the absence of pathogens, predators, or herbivores if it's a plant that we're talking about coming through. Biological control is the intentional release of a natural enemy to attack a pest population and is used in the management of an invasive species. This here is a cane toad, which is another example of an invasive species in Australia, but it's also an example of biological control gone awry. We have all these sugarcane crops. There are all these beetles eating the sugarcane crops. They introduced these cane toads, which eat the sugarcane beetles, and the cane toads just they didn't damage any of the sugarcane beetle population. They just went and they started eating other types of things, and cane toads are enormous. Like, they're roughly the size of like a chicken. Wouldn't be that much of an exaggeration. So they can eat mammals, they can eat birds, and all that kind of thing. Australia has now some of the strictest rules about what kinds of plants and animals you're allowed to bring into Australia, because they have an extremely long history of invasive species being brought into Australia. Now, at this point, you may have noticed that I've actually mentioned invasive species several times throughout this course. We talked about it during population ecology with the rabbits and the foxes and all that. We talked about it at the end of Unit 2, and now I'm talking about it again here. How bad is the problem of invasive species? We put a financial number on it at the beginning of this video, but how many of the if I just go for a walk out in the woods, how many of the species out there are invasive species? How many are native species? I was talking to someone from the U.S. Forestry Service, and they told me that if you go out and walk in the woods, about 50% of the plants that you see, ground cover plants specifically, looking at like vegetation, bushes, and plants, things like that, herbaceous plants, they are going to be invasive species. About half of all the plants that you're going to see out there are invasives or non-natives. For trees, depending on what area you go walking in, it's a little bit better. If you're in an urban area, you're going to have a lot of non-native trees. Not all non-natives are invasive. And if you're in a more natural setting, you'll have a lot more native trees. But there are some invasive trees that exist as well. There's Norway maple, sycamore maple, there's Bradford pears, there's the tree of heaven. There's a bunch of different ones on the list. So the last few videos that we've had we're specifically talking about the ways in which human populations are affecting global biodiversity, the way that we are decreasing biodiversity, because global biodiversity worldwide has been dropping. So we talked about habitat destruction, habitat fragmentation, habitat degradation. We talked about invasive species. We talked about pollution. We talked about overharvesting and overexploitation, poaching, these kinds of things. We talked about all these kind of root causes. What we're going to talk about in the next few videos is endangered species themselves, these populations that have been driven down to the point where they are at risk of extinction.